Well, we've been covering what's going on in Bosnia. They had a presidential election on October 2nd, and now the election officials have decided that they are going to go ahead with a recount of the vote. You can see some countries get recounts, others, I don't know. Why is this? Why is this happening there? Well, this morning I had a chance to sit down with a Bosnian independent journalist, Alexsandar Pavic. He's joining us from Belgrade, Serbia, and he has a lot of context on this that if you read Western media, you will not get, and I really appreciated this conversation. So take a look. Alexsandar, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about this and provide us some context. First of all, we reported on the basics of this story last night, and my pronunciation was awful. So can you please help me speak the candidates' names properly? It's Milorad Dodik.
Dodik.
Thank you. Okay, that's what I thought. I took a lot of heat from that. And the opponent is Jelena Trivic. Trivic. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. You will correct me if I get it wrong again. So the story is that there is currently a recount happening in Bosnia. You are coming from Belgrade, Serbia. Can you give me a state of the recount as it stands right now? We are 2.5 weeks past the election.
Yeah, the election was on October 2nd. Today is October 12th. The recount is going to be done tomorrow on October 13th. So it hasn't started yet.
Okay.
But the entire controversy is that the Central Election Commission of Bosnia, they ordered a recount totally outside of any procedure. They did it illegally. They did it under pressure from protests. They didn't allow the procedure. The procedure is the following: first, you count all the votes.
Yes.
And then there's a deadline for submitting complaints, and then the commission rules on those complaints or objections. That wasn't done. The Central Election Commission had counted 98% of the votes. And then they said, oh, we're stopping and we're going to do a recount. Even though just a few days prior, they said that the whole election process was fair, it was okay, they didn't see any big problems. Then all of a sudden, under pressure from protests of the opposition and also support from the American embassy, the British embassy, the EU embassy, and the OSCE representative, changed their minds. And so, we're going to have this recount starting at 3:30 p.m. local time in Sarajevo on Thursday. And of course, the ruling coalition and the Republika Srpska entity, where Milorad Dodik was leading the presidential race, they're objecting. They're saying this is illegal.
Yes.
And they're not gonna accept new elections, and they're just waiting to see what's gonna happen. But they're not gonna accept a recount that takes away the victory.
Right. Yes. And there seemed to be some spirit of concession up until these protests. So where did the protests come from? Is it surprising to you that they were so large and vocal, given that there seemed to be a winner up until the weekend protests?
Well, you know what? They weren't very large, actually.
Okay, this is what I'm not able to surmise from Western media.
Yeah.
Okay,
They
thank
were not
you.
very large. There were several thousand, 5 or 6, up to 10,000 maybe people on after the election. But the second protest drew maybe 2,000 people max. So it was already starting to peter out.
Okay.
But I did expect controversies regarding the election of Dodik. And I'll explain, if I have the time, I'll explain why we expected trouble. You see, Dodik has been the leader of the Serbs in Bosnia for the past 20 years. He's
Yes.
been winning elections. And he's been a thorn in the side of the Western countries for the last 10 years or so, because he is not on board with what they want to do. They want to centralize Bosnia. They want to practically reform the Dayton peace agreement, which is very clear. You have three constituent nations, the Serbs, the Croats, and the Muslims. They call themselves the Bosniaks now, who are supposed to be equally represented in Bosnia. However, what the West wants to do, they want to centralize Bosnia.
Mm-hmm.
They want to rule Bosnia through the Muslims. And of course, Dodik is having none of it. An even bigger transgression as far as the West is concerned. He's blocking the accession of Bosnia into NATO.
Yes.
That's a red light in Washington, London, Berlin, and Brussels. And the third thing is, he's become, let's say, a good friend, political friend of Vladimir Putin.
Yes.
And he's met with him 3 times over the past 10 months, including last month in September. He saw him in Moscow. And as a result, I expected, and others expected as well, that he would be targeted and that the Western powers would try to block his election in any way they could. So we were expecting sort of a color revolution scenario, and it looks like that's what's happening now.
Well, the Western media tells us that he advocates for the separation of the Serb Republic, but he went on television in late September and said, actually, I appreciate Vladimir Putin because he supports the Dayton Agreement, which is status quo. So those are conflicting messages. Either he wants an annexation or he doesn't. So the West is telling us he does, but from his own mouth, he seems to say he supports the Dayton agreements as they are. Is that a correct read of this situation?
Absolutely. Dodik supports the Dayton Agreement. Russia supports the Dayton Agreement. Dodik has said several times that if the Western powers allied with the Muslim leadership in Sarajevo, they continue denigrating the Dayton, that Republika Srpska won't stand for it. They won't be a part of Bosnia and Herzegovina that's not according to what the Dayton Peace Agreement says. So that's why they're accusing him of separatism, because he doesn't want to be a part of this new state building project of the West. And, Russia has been scrupulous in supporting the Dayton Agreement. They have not done a single thing or said a single thing encouraging secession. So, the Western media, as has become the custom for them, unfortunately, is portraying the situation in a totally false way.
Okay, I'm going to play this video that shows him saying exactly that he supports the Dayton Agreement as it is.
As for our political relations with Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Russian position is well known. It's exclusively related to supporting the text of the Dayton Agreement. The West has tried to dismantle the Dayton Agreement to the point that it remains on the sidelines. On the other hand, Russia remained committed to the agreement, and that's why Russia is an undoubted ally that I respect. And I also respect President Putin.
I want to ask you about NATO involvement then in Bosnia, because it is predicated on the Dayton Accords and Operation Deliberate Strike. Now, both Bosnian politicians, both candidates that are up for president in this recount, both say there was not a genocide in Bosnia in the 90s. And that seems to be agreed upon now in politics, even though the United Nations is saying they wanted to make it illegal to even say that. So can you give me some background on these claims? Because again, that is the entire predication for NATO to even be there at all now.
Yeah, this is the thing. They during the 90s, in order for NATO to justify its intervention in Bosnia, and for the United States and the EU to justify their intervention and meddling in internal affairs of Bosnia and in the breakup of Yugoslavia, they had to come up with an excuse. And the excuse was, Serbs are committing genocide. We have to prevent genocide. And that's why we're here. We're here from not because we're the old colonial powers, imperialists, but because we're humanitarians,
Right.
and we want to make sure that there's no genocide that's ever going to take place again. So they need this genocide narrative in order to justify their continued presence in Bosnia. I'll tell the Dayton Peace Accord was reached in November 21, 1995.
Yes.
So it's been almost 27 years. Bosnia still has a high representative, a foreigner, a German. The one before that was Austrian. His predecessor was British. They want to be able to run Bosnia, through this high representative who they say has a right to impose laws, change laws, replace politicians who've been elected. So they've turned Bosnia into a semi-colony just to justify their presence. And the genocide narrative is key. If there's no genocide, why are you here?
Yes.
So they don't want to let go of that. And of course, the Serbs don't want to have anything to do with that, because they don't want to be labeled as a genocidal people, because first of all, it's not true. And second of all, it's poisoning the relations between the three main peoples in Bosnia. And, that's the old divide and rule method that we know all too well.
Right. So then where is the evidence then of this? If they continue to push it, saying, yes, you did, yes, there was, then we need to stay here, right? What are they pointing to? Where can we verify what the truth is?
Well, it's very difficult. They're making it very difficult to verify the truth. They set up this kangaroo court called the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in The Hague, in the 90s. They pushed it through the Security Council. Russia at the time was under Yeltsin. They were on their knees. They couldn't oppose that. They didn't vote for it, but they didn't oppose it.
Yes.
China at the same time wasn't what it is today. So they rammed it through, even though the Security Council does not have the right to establish ad hoc tribunals. And through this tribunal, which was financed by NATO, by Western powers, who appointed both judges and the prosecution and paid the defense, so they controlled the entire finances of this tribunal. They got the judgments they needed. They got verdicts of genocide against key Serb military and political figures, and that's the mechanism they used to legitimize their claims that there was a genocide. And they're not going to let go of that, even though there's plenty of evidence that no genocide took place. I mean, even people from the Yad Vashem memorial from Ephraim Zurov, who heads the Simon Wiesenthal Center in Jerusalem, has said many times, and he's a Nazi hunter. And if there's an expert on genocide, it's the Israelis, from these institutions. They've said several times, what happened in Bosnia, what happened in Srebrenica was not a genocide.
Yeah.
So, but, they have the Hague Tribunal, these so-called verdicts, and they're waving them and saying, oh, genocide did take place.
Right. Therefore, NATO is heroic. Yes. And that is a narrative that, I mean, I've traveled in Serbia. I know that the general sentiment is not that NATO is a heroic sort of necessary force in these regions, but there is this mission creep, which they're calling Operation Althea, which they just continue to put Western troops in this region. Is this known there? Is this the sentiment that NATO continues here and we don't want this?
Well, if you asked the Serbs, most of them would be against it. But the NATO presence is not what it was. I think it's about 3,500 now in Bosnia. It used to be 50,000.
Wow.
50,000 NATO troops came into Bosnia after the Dayton Peace Accord, but they've been reducing their troop presence. But they still want to have at least a token presence,
Yeah.
and they just want to be there as a kind of a tripwire in case something happens. That they can always send more. They want to have this legal basis for sending troops there. But the main thing is that they really want to absorb Bosnia into NATO.
Yes.
And that's why Dodik is such a pain for them. They want to remove him because they think if they remove him, that they're just going to get some cooperative Serb politician who's going to rubber stamp Bosnia's accession into NATO.
Is that Jelena Trivic?
Well, she's not going to say. The opposition to Dodik is pro-Western. They regularly go to. They regularly meet with Western ambassadors. Here's a perfect example. So we had the elections on October 2nd, and Jelena Trivic and her supporters, they declared victory on election night.
Oh.
And they asked their supporters to go out into the streets to celebrate. I mean, this is a scenario we're very familiar with. Somebody declares victory, they get media on their side, and it's very hard afterwards to negate that. But it didn't really work because Dodik's advantage was too great. So what happens the next day? A delegation from Jelena Trivic's party goes to the British embassy for consultations. I mean,
right.
Come on. What more do you need?
So now when Dodik is saying this is foreign interference, he's not wrong.
No, he's not wrong. Like I said, the British embassy, the US embassy, the EU embassy, and the OSCE, which is under Western control, they all support this legal decision of the Central Election Commission to do a recount on Thursday. So yeah, Jelena Trivic has the West on her side, and that's why we may be heading into serious trouble because.
Right.
If they count differently from what the original count was, of course Dodik and his people aren't going to accept it, and then we may have a scenario like we had in Venezuela.
Oh no!
Like what, 3 years ago was it? 2019 with Guaido.
Yes.
Juan Guaido, and also like in Belarus 2
right.
years ago with Tikhanovska. She declared herself the victor with what? 10-11% of the vote, and the West just may throw its support behind Jelena Trivic,
yeah, right. And I mean, the West still doesn't really want to acknowledge Nicolas Maduro. You're right. So I guess my big question, and I'll let you finish on this, is this narrative. If we pull the thread of what the West wants us to think, is that if we don't support this Jelena Trivic, and then we might have another Ukraine on our hands. And it's very hard to work out that logic, but just that, it may lead us into another confrontation with Russia. But it seems to me that supporting the Western candidate is what would lead to another Ukraine. Can you comment on this, on the sort of parallels that I'm just having a hard time working them out in my head?
Yeah. The plan B is always if you can't get the candidate that you want elected or imposed, then the reserve option is to just cause chaos, instability, and then NATO swoops in as the peacemakers. That's something that's an option. Because the other thing I forgot to mention was Dodik is also against Bosnia imposing sanctions on Russia.
Yes.
And the same thing is in Serbia. So, the Serbs, both in Serbia and in Bosnia, are blocking sanctions against Russia. And this is very annoying for NATO, for the EU countries,
yes,
for the US. And they're also calculating if they can get Bosnia to officially impose sanctions on Russia, will put pressure on the Serbian leadership to also do it. so that Serbia doesn't become totally isolated. So this is also very important for them, and they'll put out all the stops, because also at the same time, this is not the topic of this particular show, but we're going to have a problem brewing in Kosovo, in Serbia,
Yeah.
because the West is egging on the Albanian leaders in Kosovo to cause instability. By the end of this month, there's a very important deadline that's gonna run out. We may have clashes or instability in Serbia itself, in Kosovo, and this is also under NATO supervision. There are also NATO troops down there as well.
Yes.
So we got to look at the whole picture. They want to neutralize the Serbs, who are the last standing behind this Iron Curtain they want to draw between Russia and the rest of Europe. And they'll do anything they can to eliminate this problem that they have, which is the same problem that the Nazis had in 1941 before they attacked the Soviet Union. The Serbs were against, they were not on the side of the Nazis, so they attacked Yugoslavia in April 41 in order to pacify the rear of the front. And it looks like almost a repeat of the same situation 80 years later.
Goodness. Well, that's why we are watching this election. I appreciate so much your context because, like I said, there's sort of a tunnel that Western media will let me go down as an English speaker. And so I was desperate for this context, and I appreciate it so much. Where can we find your work if we want to follow along your context?
Okay, I occasionally publish on the Strategic Culture Foundation in English. I've written a few columns on Russia Today. For RT. I'm also a frequent guest on RT.
Okay.
I just did an interview yesterday. So in English, that's where you can follow me. In Serbian, just Google me. I mean,
Okay.
every day there's either an interview or an article.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it so much. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much for giving me the chance to put the things in a factual context rather than a spin narrative that's being
Yes.
imposed by the Western mass media. Thanks very much for your show. I enjoy it very much. I watch it.
Oh,
Lots
thank
of people in Serbia watch it as well.
Thank you.
That's so nice to hear, and thank you so much. And as a political scientist, as a journalist, and someone who's covering what's going on there, it's so important to be able to get these stories out because you can see what we are up against: propaganda and Western media. If you don't have the work of somebody like Alexsandar to provide the context, it just gets lost. You won't see it. You won't hear it. It was a fascinating interview.
Right. And, as you research something like this and you just read what's been published, let's say even in just the last month, there's so many assumptions there that the Western media will tell you. Dodik's a bad guy. He likes Russia. He's full of corruption. He wants these things that he has said that he doesn't. Now, I'm not saying anything about his other political track record, but why is the West so keen to get a recount in this election?
Right.
These are what we're saying. So it's such a fascinating story, and it feels really like a ticking clock there.